He came from the rail yards and loading docks, where hands bled for wages and silence was paid in sweat. James Riddle Hoffa was not born into power. He took it, one deal at a time, one strike at a time, until the whispers stopped and the country had no choice but to listen. To the working man, he was a prophet. To the mob, a partner. To the government, a threat that wouldn't stay quiet. And then he was gone, no bullet, no body, no goodbyes, just an empty parking lot and a silence that never stopped echoing. This is not just the story of a man who vanished. It's the story of how America made him disappear. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. It was July 30th, 1975, a Wednesday, and it was hot, the kind of Midwestern summer heat that settles in the bones of old houses and lingers on the steel of parked cars like a grudge. In Bloomfield Township, just north of Detroit, the streets moved like they had something to prove. The town was neat, suburban, quiet, a place where nothing ever really happened, and where everything happened exactly as it should. But on that day, something would unravel so quietly, so cleanly, that it would leave the nation breathless. At precisely 2:45 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa stepped out of his maroon Pontiac Grandville in the parking lot of the Machu's Red Fox, a restaurant with a brown and gold sign, red carpet, linen tablecloths, the kind of place where businessmen discussed things in lowered tones and waiters remembered your name. Hoffa had been there before. It was familiar. It felt safe. He walked with purpose. Blue pants, white shirt, navy sports coat. The air was thick, pressing against his clothes like an old enemy. He checked his watch. The meeting was set for 2 o'clock. They were late, not like them. Not like Provenzano, not like Giacalone. He paused, scanning the lot. Behind him, cars idled by. Inside, a glass of iced tea sweated on the table he'd been led to. Untouched, waiting. So was he. What Jimmy Hoffa didn't know, what no one did, was that this moment, this step into the sunlit quiet of a parking lot, would be the last time anyone ever saw him alive. There were no screams, no struggle, no sounds of violence, just absence. His Pontiac would sit in that parking space until evening, the keys still in the ignition, his wallet in the glove compartment, his heart medication sealed neatly in a pillbox under the passenger seat. No signs of a break-in, no traces of blood, no evidence that anything had happened at all. The restaurant staff assumed he'd left with friends. The FBI assumed he'd been taken. His family assumed, prayed, he was late or stubborn or angry. Hoffa had been many things, but late was never one of them. The first call came around 6 o'clock p.m. By midnight, Bloomfield police were involved. By morning, the FBI. By the weekend, the nation, and yet nothing. Not a body, not a witness, not a trace. Like a magician's sleight of hand, the trick wasn't in what people saw, it was in what they didn't. And Jimmy Hoffa, the bulldog of American labor, the man who once brought Wall Street to its knees with a single phone call, had vanished into thin air in broad daylight. There's something obscene about a disappearance. It offends logic, it violates rhythm, because when someone dies, we have rituals, coffins, obituaries, the aching finality of a closed casket. But when someone disappears, we're left in limbo, waiting, speculating, rewriting memories to try and make sense of absence. For decades, the question would haunt everyone who ever knew his name. Where did Jimmy Hoffa go? Who wanted him gone? And why? But to understand the power of that silence, we have to rewind before the parking lot, before the iced tea, before the betrayal, to a boy born on Valentine's Day, 1913, in a place called Brazil, Indiana, but not yet. First, we sit in the Echo, July 31st, 1975, Day 1. The newspapers barely had time to breathe. Hoffa feared abducted. The Detroit Free Press ran it in bold. Television anchors stumbled over themselves trying to balance caution with alarm. Jimmy Hoffa, the man whose fists had once built the Teamsters into a juggernaut, was missing, and no one knew how to say it without sounding hysterical. In Washington, old rivals didn't speak, not on the record. In Chicago, the outfit pretended it was just another Thursday. In Las Vegas, men who owed their fortunes to Teamster loans checked their rearview mirrors twice. Hoffa had made a lot of friends. He had made more enemies. In the days that followed, the FBI searched everywhere. The field behind the Red Fox, a Pontiac dealership, the Detroit River, a house near Telegraph Road. They followed a bloodhound that picked up his scent at the restaurant, then lost it 10 feet from the curb. A waitress said she saw him. A trucker swore he drove him. A gardener claimed he heard screams, but it all led nowhere. Every witness was either lying, mistaken, or dead, and the iced tea remained untouched. Sweat pooled beneath the glass, the lemon wedge dried and curled. Time passed, and with it, a quiet realization. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was an erasure. August 1975. 2 weeks later, the FBI made a formal statement. Hoffa was presumed dead. No ransom, no demands, just an exclamation point drawn in vanishing ink. Speculation turned wild. Some said the mafia had killed him for trying to retake power. Others blamed the government. Hoover's last revenge. A few believed he'd fled. Staged it. Started fresh in South America. The theories spun out like thread on a loom, each one weaving a different portrait of a man already becoming legend. And yet, the real story remained hidden, buried under dirt, or cement, or silence. The house across the street from the Red Fox had a swing set in the yard. On that Wednesday afternoon, 2 children had played there. One later said they saw a car drive away, fast. The license plate was half remembered, the direction vague. The FBI filed it and moved on. There were hundreds of sightings, thousands of tips, but no patterns, no proof, just ghosts. November 1975, 4 months later. Thanksgiving came and went. The Hoffa family set a place at the table. They didn't speak his name aloud. To do so would have made it real. Instead, they let the space speak for them. The nation had already moved on. New stories, new scandals. But in Detroit, in that narrow corridor of silence between what Hoffa had been and what he had vanished into, people were still watching, still waiting. 1980s, a decade of echoes. Each year, a new theory surfaced, a new confession, a new map to nowhere. One man claimed Hoffa was buried under the end zone of Giants Stadium. Another swore he was burned in a mob-owned incinerator. In Michigan, Frank Sheeran, a trusted associate, would later claim he shot Hoffa in the back of the head at a Detroit house and watched others dispose of the body. No physical evidence ever matched. The house was searched, floorboards removed, blood found, but not Hoffa's. DNA confirmed that still the story gained traction. It felt real. It felt like closure, but it wasn't. 1995, 20 years later, Hoffa was declared legally dead. There was no ceremony, no funeral, just a government document. A line through a name. He had built an empire. He had fought presidents, senators, mob bosses, and in the end, he became a question mark, a final glance back. When you walk the parking lot of the Matthews Red Fox today, now closed, its windows empty, its walls faded, you might not feel anything at first. It's just asphalt, trees, suburbia. But beneath that ordinary stillness is an invisible scar, a place where history folded in on itself. On that hot July afternoon in 1975, Jimmy Hoffa didn't just disappear, he was removed, effaced. And no matter how many men have tried to fill in the blank, the outline remains uncolored. He was there, and then he wasn't. And so begins the story, not with birth, but with loss. This is not a biography. It's not just a crime story. It's a reckoning with the cost of power, the silence of betrayal, and the strange gravity of a man who still casts a shadow, even when he's no longer standing in the sun. February 14th, 1913, Valentine's Day, but there were no roses in Brazil. Indiana, just coal dust, cold floors, and the sound of men coughing in their sleep. James Riddle Hoffa was born into a world where survival was the only romance. His father, John, worked as a coal driller, lungs blackened before his time, hands too calloused to feel his children's cheeks. His mother, Viola, kept the house upright through sheer will. She was a woman made of wood and wire, Catholic, strict, with sorrow behind her eyes and discipline in every motion. The name Riddle came from a preacher's family name, but it would prove prophetic, for Jimmy Hoffa would grow to be America's unsolved question. Part saint, part monster, depending on where you stood. By the time Hoffa could speak, the world was already teaching him what it meant to be overlooked. Brazil was the kind of place that didn't make the papers, forgotten by prosperity, remembered only when someone died in a mining collapse. Life came hard and fast, and rarely stayed long. His father's health failed when Jimmy was still a child. The coal took him, slow and cruel. After that, everything changed. The family packed what little they owned and headed north. Detroit, a new city, a new start. But poverty travels well, and the streets of Motor City were paved with the same bitter concrete. They settled into a 2-room house on the outskirts. His mother found work where she could washing clothes, cooking for neighbors. Hoffa, still just a boy, watched as pride gave way to pragmatism, the kind of dignity that keeps you upright. Even when you're hungry, school didn't last long. At 14, he dropped out, not from rebellion, but necessity. The family needed money, and the factories always needed hands. He found work at a Kroger's warehouse on the west side, stacking crates, unloading trucks, sweating through layers of grime for just a few coins a day. The hours were long. The foremen were cruel, and there were no protections, no breaks, no rules, no reason to speak up. Unless you were Jimmy Hoffa. He wasn't big, 5'5", on a good day, but he carried himself like a man twice that. There was something in the way he stood, shoulders forward, chin up, eyes that didn't blink even when the bosses yelled. He was the kind of teenager men followed instinctively, because he looked like he already knew what came next. By 15, he'd seen the worst of it. Men collapsing from heat exhaustion, fingers crushed beneath pallets, wages docked without explanation. But what struck Hoffa most wasn't the cruelty. It was the silence. No one complained, no one resisted. They just endured that, to him, felt like death. He began to talk, quietly at first, then louder, in corners, in loading bays, in locker rooms filled with cigarette smoke and hopelessness. He told them they deserved better, that they weren't dogs, that they could ask no, demand safer conditions, fair hours, a wage that meant something. The older men laughed, called him kid, but some of them listened, and slowly Jimmy Hoffa became a voice. 1932. Detroit. The city trembled under the weight of the Great Depression. Factories shut down overnight. Soup kitchens stretched around the block, and yet the warehouses remained, grinding, always grinding that summer. Kroger's warehouse workers organized a strike, not a spontaneous walkout, a coordinated act. They refused to load strawberries into trucks unless their demands were met. Better pay, better hours, some sense of human dignity. And at the center of it all, the 15-year-old who had once stacked crates, Jimmy Hoffa. It wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. The drivers backed the loaders backed the stockmen, and the message was clear. No trucks moved without the men's approval. Kroger caved, not because they wanted to, because they had to. It was a small victory, but it was enough. Hoffa saw it happen with his own eyes. Power didn't have to be inherited. It could be seized. And from that moment forward, he knew who he was. Not a warehouse grunt, not a forgotten child, a leader. He was young still when he first crossed paths with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Back then, the union was scattered pockets of truckers in scattered cities, loosely connected, poorly funded, and deeply vulnerable. The idea was there, but the organization was thin. Hoffa joined a Detroit local chapter in the mid-1930s. He started small, organizing strikes, negotiating minor disputes, but his instincts were sharper than most. He understood fear, he understood need. More importantly, he understood leverage. Truckers weren't just drivers, they were arteries. They carried the lifeblood of America's economy, food, goods, fuel. If they stopped, everything stopped, and Hoffa knew how to make that threat feel real. He traveled from warehouse to warehouse, from diner to diner, speaking to men who had never once been listened to. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't speak in slogans. He understood them, their exhaustion, their anger, their silence, and in return, they gave him loyalty. By 1936, Hoffa had become a key organizer for Local 299, a Detroit Teamsters chapter that would become the seat of his growing power. He negotiated contracts with companies twice his size. He stood toe-to-toe with executives in polished offices. He yelled when others whispered, but even then, Hoffa wasn't just a loudmouth. He studied labor law obsessively. He memorized statutes, knew clauses. By heart, he didn't want to beg for fairness. He wanted to force it. The man who had once been too poor to buy lunch was now telling millionaires when their trucks would roll. He never forgot what it felt like to be small. That memory never left him. It just hardened into resolve. By the time he was in his early 20s, Hoffa wasn't simply an organizer. He was a force, the kind of man who walked into a room and changed its temperature. He drank black coffee, smoked cigars down to the nub, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and always kept notes. He trusted few, feared none, and his mother, Viola, now older, now quieter, watched from the kitchen window as her son became the kind of man his father never had time to be. She didn't always agree with his choices, but she respected his. Fire, in Hoffa's mind, this wasn't about rebellion. It was about balance. He saw the rich getting richer, the workers staying poor, and the system creaking under the weight of its own silence. He didn't want charity. He wanted fairness, and if he had to shout to get it, then so be it. There were setbacks, fights, threats, late nights where he slept in cars between cities, holding folders of contracts on his lap like armor. He was punched. He was blacklisted. He was called a communist, a thug, a fraud. But every time he was knocked down, he stood back up, short, scrappy, smiling like he knew something they didn't. By 1939, he was a national figure in labor organizing, and he was just getting started. But Hoffa also understood something darker. That power required protection, that movements, when they grew large enough, needed muscle. And in Detroit, in Chicago, in New York, there were men willing to offer that muscle for a price. The lines between labor and crime were already blurring. He didn't blink to Hoffa. If the law wouldn't protect workers, then maybe someone else would. And if the handshake came with a shadow behind it, That was the cost of winning. He stood in front of thousands now in union halls, stadiums, even parking lots. His speeches weren't poetic. They were real. We work hard, we demand respect, and we don't back down. That was his gospel, not for the cameras, not for history. For the men whose hands were cracked open by steering wheels and pallet jacks, they listened, they believed, and so the boy from Brazil, Indiana, the butcher's son, the dropout, the stacker of crates became something larger than himself. A movement, a reckoning, and for the first time in his life, Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just fighting against something. He was building something, something that would one day become an empire. The crates smelled like bruised sugar. Detroit, 1932. Beneath the metal awnings of the Kroger warehouse on Fort Street, the air was thick with summer sweat, crushed fruit, and tension. Rows of wooden pallets stacked with strawberries, deep red, fragile, destined for markets far from the hands that packed them. Men moved through that space like machines. Their shirts clung to their backs. Their breath steamed in the heat. Each crate was a burden. Each shift a dare to collapse. Jimmy Hoffa stood near the edge of the loading dock, watching a foreman shout at a worker who had dropped a box. No apology, no hesitation, just venom. Hoffa didn't flinch. He watched the older man bow his head, stoop again, and lift the crate with trembling hands. It was the last week of June. The strawberries were in season. And for Jimmy Hoffa, so was defiance. At 19, he was already known in corners of Detroit's warehouses, not for his fists, but for his words. He wasn't a big man, but his voice carried. Something about the way he spoke, direct, certain, shaped by sweat and bone, made other men listen, made them feel seen. He wasn't a manager. He wasn't educated, but he was something else entirely. The kind of man who made others believe the system could be forced to look them in the eye. And that week, Hoffa had had enough. The strike didn't start with speeches. It started with silence. At 5:45 a.m., just before the first truck was to be loaded, Hoffa stood at the warehouse entrance, arms crossed, jaw set. One by one, the men showed up. They looked at him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. They walked past the crates, past the foreman, and stood beside him. By 6 o'clock a.m., nothing had moved. Not a single strawberry had left the dock. Inside the warehouse, supervisors scrambled. Phones rang, orders barked. But the men didn't budge. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their silence louder than any chant. These were not radicals. They were fathers, veterans, immigrants with worn boots and cracked fingernails. They weren't demanding wealth. They were demanding dignity, better hours, fair pay, no more threats over lunch breaks. The foreman tried yelling. He tried threats. He even called the police. But the officers knew these men. They went to church with them, lived on their streets, ate at their tables. No arrests were made. That night, Hoffa sat on the curb with half a sandwich in his hand and a cigarette burning low. Around him, men spoke in low voices. Some were scared, some were proud. All were waiting. By the third day, Kroger caved. They agreed to a modest pay increase, shorter shifts during peak hours, and a promise no retaliation. The men returned. To work, the crates were loaded. The trucks rolled again, but something had changed. Hoffa didn't celebrate. He studied. He watched how power moved, how the company flinched not because it cared, but because it feared being stopped. He realized then, labor didn't need to beg. It needed to leverage, and leverage didn't come from numbers. It came from unity, that small victory, a few cents an hour, a slightly shorter shift, was his first real taste of influence. Not on paper, in people's lives. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had turned fear into solidarity. It was intoxicating and dangerous, because now, Jimmy Hoffa wanted more. Late 1932, Detroit. Hoffa began attending meetings with Local 299 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Back then, the union was fractured, a patchwork of disconnected drivers, dock workers, and warehouse men scattered across cities and towns. The leadership was old, tired, and in some cases compromised. But Hoffa didn't see failure. He saw opportunity. The union needed new blood. Someone unafraid of speaking plainly. Someone who understood the grind of labor not as a slogan, but as a daily truth. Hoffa brought with him a kind of magnetic intensity, not just in speeches, but in presence. He wasn't polished, he wasn't clean-cut, but he was real. He knew every route in Detroit by memory, knew which companies exploited workers, knew which warehouses docked pay unfairly, and more importantly, knew which men were ready to fight. Back in the winter of 1933, he helped organize a campaign to unionize Detroit's produce haulers, an underpaid, overworked group of drivers who delivered perishables to every grocer in the city. These weren't men used to unions. They were solo operators used to being overlooked. But Hoffa knew how to speak to them, not with leaflets, with conversation. He met them in diners, in garages, at loading docks just before sunrise, he remembered. Their wives' names, their kids' birthdays. He knew who was behind on their rent, who owed money to loan sharks, who was scared, and he listened. By spring, nearly all of them had signed union cards. Wage negotiations followed. The companies, caught off guard, agreed to new terms. It was another quiet victory, but the word was spreading in labor halls across Michigan and Ohio. One name began surfacing again and again, Hoffa, but with attention came opposition. Not just from employers, from inside the union. Some old-timers didn't like his pace. Others didn't trust his ambition. They called him too loud, too fast, too hungry. They weren't wrong. Hoffa was hungry. He didn't want to settle for Detroit. He wanted a national reach. And to get there, he'd need more than idealism. He'd need structure, strategy, and sometimes strength. In 1934, a strike in Toledo turned violent. Union men were beaten. One lost an eye. Police stood by. Hoffa was there, watching it all unfold. He saw the line between law and interest, and how easily it bent. He realized something that day, something he would carry for the rest of his life. The law didn't protect the working man. It protected order, and if labor wanted justice, it had to enforce it. Not through riots, not through chaos, through discipline and alliances. That was the year he was introduced to an enforcer from the Chicago outfit, a man with cold eyes and warm hands who smiled too easily and spoke too little. The man offered protection for union meetings. Security, he called it, nothing. More, Hoffa didn't shake his hand, not then, but he remembered the name. Because while Hoffa believed in the cause deeply, religiously, he also understood that movements weren't sacred, and they were vulnerable. And when you're building something fragile, sometimes you hire guards. By the end of the decade, Local 299 was the most powerful Teamsters chapter in the Midwest, and Hoffa was its undisputed voice. He was on the road constantly, from Pittsburgh to Indianapolis to Chicago, signing drivers, smoothing disputes, building relationships. He spoke at midnight in gas station parking lots. He slept on the floor of motel rooms with hand-scrawled maps taped to the walls. He had no office, no secretary, just a folder of contacts, a stack of contracts, and a phone number written in greased pencil on the inside of his windshield. He was never still, because stillness to Hoffa was Surrender 1939. The Teamsters were on the cusp of becoming the largest labor union in America, but growth came with risk. Disputes flared, territories overlapped, leadership squabbled, and cracks began to show. That was when Hoffa made his move. He didn't ask for permission. He organized a coalition of key locals, men he'd worked with, stood with, bled with. Together they pushed for national integration. A centralized plan, one contract, one fund, one voice, and Hoffa would be that voice. But behind closed doors, something else was shifting. The outfit, the syndicate, the 5 families. Organized crime had begun to take notice of the Teamsters. Pension fund, a financial behemoth that, if controlled, could bankroll hotels, casinos, entire cities. And Hoffa was pragmatic. He saw what others refused to, that politics, like labor, was about relationships. And in the America of the 1940s, the mafia had more influence in some towns than City Hall. He didn't romanticize them. He didn't fear them. He saw them as a tool, dangerous, yes, but useful, the same way that company men had their lawyers and their lobbyists. Hoffa would have his men. The Strawberry Strike of 1932, small, forgotten by most, was where it all started. A box of fruit, a line in the sand, and a 19-year-old who believed silence was a form of surrender. He had spoken. Others had followed, and from that moment forward, Jimmy Hoffa would never stop speaking. Not until the day the world stopped hearing him. It began with a whisper, a single, anonymous tip phoned in to the Detroit Free Press in the spring of 1946. If you want to know why the trucks run smooth, ask who greased the wheels. No name, no address, just a riddle. But by then, everyone in Detroit already knew the answer. Jimmy Hoffa, the short, sharp-edged man with fire in his gut, had become the fulcrum on which the American labor force balanced. He wasn't just leading workers, he was mobilizing them, and someone, somewhere, was making sure no one stood in his way. By the late 1940s, the Teamsters Union had ballooned to over 12 million members. It was the largest, fastest-growing labor union in the country, and Jimmy Hoffa was its storm-eyed architect. But with every contract signed, with every new chapter added, another set of eyes followed him, eyes behind mirrored glasses, eyes behind courtroom benches, and most dangerously, eyes across smoky tables in the backs of Italian restaurants. Because Hoffa had a secret, one he didn't hide, but never spoke aloud. The Teamsters weren't just growing because of labor power. They were growing because of enforcement, and that enforcement came from men who didn't carry union cards. They carried guns. Chicago, 1947, the Ambassador East Hotel, room 903. Hoffa sat across from a man who introduced himself only as Vinny. He was polite, smiled easily, offered Hoffa a drink. Though he didn't touch one himself, the conversation wasn't long. Vinny explained quietly that there had been issues with a group of drivers out of Joliet. They weren't paying dues. They were undercutting routes. One of them had thrown a brick at a union organizer's windshield. Vinny asked what Jimmy wanted done. Hoffa didn't answer directly. He just said, "This country doesn't run without trucks, and trucks don't run without order." By morning, the Joliet problem disappeared, and Hoffa never asked what happened. He didn't have to. The partnership between labor and the mafia wasn't born from ideology. It was born from need, in a country still recovering from war, where strikes were seen as sabotage and union men were labeled communists. Labor leaders needed muscle, the kind that could move quietly and act decisively, and the mob. They needed access to money, to infrastructure, to men who wouldn't talk. It was a perfect match, a union built on sweat and struggle, a criminal empire built on silence and fear, and in the middle, Hoffa not because he was greedy, but because he understood leverage. The heart of the arrangement was the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, a pool of money fed by worker contributions and managed by a small group of men. Hoffa among them. By 1955, that fund held over $300 million, an unfathomable fortune at the time, intended for retirement, health care, and security. But in practice, it became a shadow bank for the mob. Loans flowed from that fund into casinos in Las Vegas, into hotels in Miami, into strip clubs in New Jersey, and trucking companies in New York. And Hoffa approved it all. He didn't do it blindly. He did it with intent, because for every favor granted, he received one in return: protection, compliance, loyalty. And for a man like Hoffa, those three things were currency more valuable than any dollar. One of Hoffa's most critical alliances was with Anthony Tony Provenzano, a capo in the Genovese crime family and a Teamster vice president based in New Jersey. Tony Pro was the kind of man who could kill you with a handshake and make your children feel safe while he did it. To outsiders, he was charismatic. To insiders, lethal. But to Hoffa, Tony Pro was necessary. When a warehouse in Newark refused to recognize union contracts, Tony sent men to block its exits. When a rival organizer tried poaching drivers in Jersey City, his tires were found slashed and his kneecaps broken. Nothing was traced back, no one was arrested, and Hoffa's influence grew stronger. They weren't friends, they didn't have to be, they had interests. And for the better part of a decade, those interests were perfectly aligned. But perhaps the most powerful and most dangerous alliance came from the South. Carlos Marcello, boss of the New Orleans Mafia, known as the Little Man for his stature and his volcanic temper, Marcello controlled ports, import businesses, dock workers, and through a shell company, he also controlled contracts for fruit, shipments across the Gulf Coast. Hoffa and Marcello struck a quiet deal in 1958. No formal signatures, just a handshake in a darkened back room behind a seafood restaurant in Baton Rouge. In exchange for union loyalty and pension-backed loans, Marcello would deliver votes, suppress dissent, and make sure no other families touched Hoffa's interests. In the South, it was, in essence, a non-aggression pact between labor and La Cosa Nostra. And for several years it worked beautifully. The Teamsters expanded to over 2 million members. Contracts were signed at record pace. Pensions grew. And Hoffa, the son of a coal driller, became a kingmaker. Presidents feared him. Senators envied him. Workers worshipped him. He stood at the center of a machine fueled by steel, sweat, and silence. But beneath that steel, something darker had taken root. By the early 1960s, the FBI had begun to take notice, not just of Hoffa's rise, but of his relationships. Wiretaps picked up hushed conversations between mobsters referencing our boy Jimmy, beatings at Italian social clubs, late-night visits to restaurants with no menus and back doors with no locks. And then came the files, thick gray folders stamped confidential in red ink. Inside, memos, surveillance reports, photographs. In one, Hoffa is seen shaking hands with Sam Giancana. In another, he's seated at a long table beside Teamsters treasurers and known enforcers. No arrests were made, but the walls were closing. And the symbiosis had made him powerful, but it also made him vulnerable. Hoffa never denied knowing mobsters. I talked to whoever picks up the phone. He once said to a journalist it was part deflection, part pride. He believed the government's war on organized crime was really a war on labor, that the powers in Washington didn't want to see working-class men rise. And in a way, that wasn't wrong, but what Hoffa refused to admit even to himself. was that the mob wasn't just using the Teamsters. They were inside it, feeding off it, and someday they might not need him anymore. Inside union halls, whispers began. Some feared Hoffa was giving too much away. Others believed he was untouchable. But the truth sat somewhere in between. He had become a bridge between blue-collar America and underworld power, between men who clocked in at dawn and men who never slept. And like any bridge, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to burn it. In 1961, Hoffa stood before a packed hall in St. Louis, 2,000 union members shoulder to shoulder, sweat clinging to their collars. He leaned into the microphone and said, "They call me a crook. I say I'm the man keeping your lights on. They call me a thug. I say I'm the one making sure your kids eat. They want to tear me down. Fine, but they better be ready to do my job, and I promise they can't." The crowd roared. Chants echoed off the rafters outside. 2 FBI agents watched from a parked sedan. One turned to the other and said, "This guy's not going down. Easy." And he didn't. For nearly 2 decades, Hoffa maintained the balancing act. He made deals with men who carried knives in their sleeves. He signed contracts with a pen in one hand and a warning in the other. He kept order. He delivered results. He enforced silence, but every favor came with a tab, and eventually someone would come to collect in the dark corridors of Las Vegas casinos, in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the cold concrete garages of Newark. The Teamsters' money flowed, laundered, doubled, disappeared, and Hoffa watched it all. Not with shame, but with calculation. To him, the mob wasn't an infestation. It was a conduit, a necessary cost in an unfair world. And as long as the union grew, as long as his men were paid, he didn't ask where the rest went. But the truth was simple. Jimmy Hoffa didn't control the mafia. He bargained with it. And someday, the men who took his money would no longer need his name. The trucks moved like blood through the arteries of a sleeping giant. America, 1955, 16-wheelers thundered across the interstates. Box trucks rattled through alleyways and factory gates. Freights pulled long into the dark, cutting ribbons of light across farmland, mountains, frozen plains, from Bakersfield to Boston, Pittsburgh to Phoenix. If something needed moving, it moved through the Teamsters, and behind the Teamsters stood Jimmy Hoffa. He didn't hold elected office. He didn't command a battalion, but his signature could shut down the United States economy in less than a day. And everyone knew it. By the mid-1950s, Hoffa had become more than a labor leader. He was a living symbol, carved out of gravel, ambition, and rage. More than 2 million members belonged to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And through Hoffa's ruthless organizing, even industries untouched by freight, warehousemen, bus drivers, airline workers began wearing the Teamster badge. To be a Teamster was to be protected, to be fed, to be seen, and to oppose the Teamsters was to invite chaos. There was a quote once whispered in a Chicago boardroom. No one knows who first said it, but it stuck. God owns the sky, Hoffa owns the roads. That wasn't hyperbole. That was logistics. In the post-war boom of 1950s America, when suburbs spread like wildfire and consumption became religion, trucking was everything, and Hoffa knew it. He didn't just build a union. He built infrastructure, pension plans, healthcare systems, negotiated routes that carved America into manageable sections of power. If milk was delivered on time in Ohio, if concrete reached a bridge site in Utah, if lettuce stayed cold crossing the Mojave, chances are Jimmy Hoffa made it happen. He dressed the part, 3-piece suits, often gray or charcoal, always pressed, French-cuffed shirts, wide silk ties. He smoked cigars not as indulgence, but as punctuation. When the smoke hung in the air, you knew he was thinking. He didn't travel with bodyguards. Not always. But he didn't have to. His reputation was its own protection. In Teamster halls across the country, his portrait was hung beside the flag. He spoke to crowds not as a politician, but as a worker. He knew how to read a room, if it was a steel town. He told stories of carrying iron rods. If it was farm country, he'd talk about waking at dawn with sore hands. He remembered names. He asked about wives, kids, cousins in Cleveland. He wasn't like his members. He was one of them, and when he raised his hand, the crowd rose with him. But power has two faces. In the corner offices of Detroit and Manhattan, executives met in hushed circles. Hoffa's name was passed like a warning label. He could strike without notice. He could delay shipments. He could pit one company against another and walk away with a better deal every time. He didn't play by the old rules. He wrote his own. They called him a thug. They accused him of blackmail. They painted him as a man who wrapped himself in the American flag while emptying its wallet. But they also knew this. If you wanted peace on the roads, you needed his signature. At a 1956 contract meeting in Chicago, a freight company executive complained about the pension rate. Hoffa didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He leaned forward and said, "You can pay them now or pay the funeral costs when they drop dead on. The loading dock, your choice." The man signed the contract. He never apologized for his tactics. Because to Hoffa, it wasn't about elegance. It was about results. He believed in a version of America that didn't wait politely in line. If a man worked 60 hours a week hauling steel through snowstorms, he deserved a pension that meant something. If he missed his child's graduation to keep the trucks running on time, he deserved to retire with dignity. And if someone had a problem with that, then maybe they'd prefer their freight rotting in a yard for 6 weeks. The empire of trucks wasn't just about goods. It was about identity. For the men behind the wheel, mostly working class, mostly white, many veterans, the Teamsters, gave them something few institutions had ever offered. Power, real, tangible, negotiable power. They could say no. They could demand more. They could strike and win, and behind every grievance, every negotiation, was the man they called Jimmy. But Hoffa's empire wasn't built on affection alone. It was enforced with deals, debts, and loyalty that ran deeper than policy. Teamster locals that resisted national consolidation found their charters revoked. Rivals who questioned Hoffa's use of union funds were sidelined. Critics, both inside and outside the movement, found themselves isolated, humiliated, or quietly removed. And always Hoffa had deniability. He never lifted a hand, but the machinery around him did. The press circled in 1957. The McClellan Committee, a Senate investigation into labor corruption, began pulling. Threads, television cameras captured hours of testimony. Hoffa appeared often. He'd lean back in his chair, hands folded, eyes unwavering. He spoke plainly, confidently, never sweating. When Robert F. Kennedy, then chief counsel for the committee, asked about alleged mob ties, Hoffa shot back. "You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in headlines." The tension between them was electric. Two visions of America colliding across a Senate desk. One was the polished New England idealist. The other, the street-born tactician, and the country watched, rapt. The hearings didn't break him. They made him larger, because every insult hurled, every accusation filed, was seen by his base as proof that he was doing something right. He didn't bow to Washington. He defied it, and for millions of working Americans, that was enough in Las Vegas. Casinos were funded by Teamster loans. In New York, garbage routes flowed smoother with union oversight. In Kansas City, building contractors knew to clear deals with local Teamster reps before pouring concrete. Hoffa didn't run these businesses. He enabled them. The empire of trucks had expanded into an unseen web of influence. Real estate, politics, airlines, distribution networks, and still, he claimed to be just a servant of the working man. He kept a simple office, 2 flags behind his desk, the American flag and the Teamster Standard, a photo of his mother, stacks of correspondence. Sorted by region, he worked long hours, slept little, trusted few. In private, he confessed only to a small handful that the thing that scared him most was weakness. Weakness of will, of backbone, of character. He saw it everywhere, in politicians and bureaucrats, even in some of his union peers, but never in himself. He once told a reporter, "The day I can't protect these men, that's the day I quit." But that day's not coming. It sounded like bravado, but he meant it. By 1959, he stood at the pinnacle, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, commander of the largest private labor organization in the world, a man whose phone calls were returned by senators, governors, and mafia dons alike. But what no one knew, not yet, was that Hoffa had already begun to look over his shoulder. Because when you build something that large, something that powerful, you can't help but wonder when someone will come to tear it down. And in Hoffa's world, enemies didn't wear uniforms. They wore smiles, still. For that one moment in time, America's highways hummed with freight. The workers were paid. The trucks ran on time. And at the center of it all, a short man with a quick temper, a slow cigar, and the belief that power wasn't given. It was taken Washington, D.C., May 2nd, 1957. The hearing room at the Senate office building buzzed like a hive of wasps. Reporters scribbled in spiral notebooks. Television cameras hissed under the lights, and the air was thick with the scent of sweat and ink. On one side of the room sat rows of men in polished shoes and dark ties. Senators, legal aides, journalists. At the center of it all, framed like a prize fighter in a suit that didn't quite hide the tension beneath, sat James Riddle Hoffa. He lit a cigar, slowly, deliberately. He was not here to apologize. He was here to fight. Across the room, at a long mahogany table, with its papers perfectly arranged, sat a man 15 years younger, clean-cut, slim, clear-eyed, a Harvard mouth and a prosecutor's spine. Robert Francis Kennedy, Chief Counsel for the Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, better known as the McClellan Committee. And from the moment their eyes locked, it was war, 2 Americas, 2 ideas of justice, 2 men who hated everything the other stood for. Kennedy had grown up in the filtered light of Massachusetts estates. Bred in the mold of service and legacy, he believed in law, in order, in the power of institutions. To him, Hoffa wasn't just corrupt. He was a threat to the very fabric of American democracy. Hoffa, born to dirt floors and dead ends, believed in pressure. He believed that power didn't come from institutions. It came from making people move. He saw Kennedy as a privileged boy with clean hands trying to preach morality to men who had built America on their backs and broken fingernails, and neither man would ever forgive the other for what they saw in him. From 1957 to 1959, the McClellan Committee became the most watched legal spectacle in the country. A kind of Cold War dressed as courtroom drama. Millions tuned in, housewives, truckers, factory managers, politicians. It wasn't just about corruption. It was about character. Hoffa, unshaken by subpoenas or camera flashes, became a star. He leaned back in his chair, puffed his cigar, and spoke with a gravel-edged growl that felt like street justice dressed in a 3-piece suit. Kennedy pressed. him again and again, with documents, with witness statements, with wiretap logs. But Hoffa parried like a man born for the ring. "You're just trying to make a headline. Bobby," he said during one exchange, "you're not interested in the truth, just the theater." Kennedy didn't blink. "I'm interested in exposing a man who's turned a union into a personal bank." And so it went, word for word, blow for blow. Behind closed doors their hatred simmered. Kennedy saw Hoffa as dangerous, a man who consorted with the mafia, who strong-armed businessmen, who bent the rules until they snapped. He referred to Hoffa as the most dangerous man in America. Hoffa saw Kennedy as a Boy Scout with too much power and too little understanding of the real world in private. He referred to him with words that couldn't be printed. In public, he smirked whenever Kennedy stepped into the room. It wasn't just politics, it was personal. By 1960, the rivalry took on a new dimension. John F. Kennedy was running for president, and Robert F. Kennedy was running interference. Still obsessed with bringing Hoffa down, JFK needed the Union vote. Hoffa could deliver it, and so a meeting was arranged. Palm Beach, Florida, late summer. JFK met Hoffa behind closed doors. The details are still debated. Some say Hoffa promised support in exchange for leniency. Others say no deal was ever struck. What's known is that the Teamsters did support Kennedy, but Bobby never stopped chasing Jimmy, and when JFK was elected, he named Robert F. Kennedy Attorney General, the chief prosecutor of the United States. And now Hoffa wasn't just facing hearings, he was facing the full weight of federal law. The Justice Department opened investigations into every corner of Hoffa's empire. Union records were subpoenaed, informants were flipped, wiretaps were placed in union halls, hotel rooms, car telephones. Every call, every meeting, every favor, traced, noted, filed. Still, Hoffa remained untouchable. He fired back with lawyers, public statements, and countersuits. He called Kennedy's actions harassment, accused him of using the Justice Department to settle personal scores. And to many Americans, it looked exactly like that. Polls showed the public split. To some, Hoffa was a villain in a tailored coat. To others, he was a martyr, a working man bullied by the ivory towers of Washington. Then came Chattanooga in 1962. Hoffa was indicted for tampering with a grand jury during a prior trial in Tennessee. The government alleged he had paid off a juror, that he'd used cash from the Union to secure a not guilty verdict. The trial was dramatic, but ended in a hung jury. It was a blow to Kennedy, but not a fatal one. The very next year, Hoffa was indicted again, this time for using Teamster pension funds to make illegal loans to organized crime figures. A second case, a second battlefield, and this one would stick. The trial took place in Chattanooga. Again, dozens of witnesses, paper trails of fund transfers, allegations of bribes, threats, favors traded for silence. At the center was Hoffa, still defiant, still sharp, but something had changed. The lines around his eyes had deepened. He spoke less in punchlines and more in strategy. The press, once enamored, had begun to turn, and Kennedy? He watched from Washington, no longer Attorney General, but still invested. Still watching, still hoping. This time the verdict came back. Guilty. Hoffa was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison for jury tampering and fraud. And though Kennedy had not been the prosecutor, it was widely seen as his victory. Privately, Kennedy told a colleague he thought he was bigger than the law. "No one is." Hoffa's response, relayed through a Teamster newsletter, was simpler. "If I go down, I'll go down standing." It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a collision of mythologies. Kennedy, the idealist, born into privilege, shaped by tragedy, fueled by vision. Hoffa, the realist, born into poverty, shaped by labor, fueled by survival. One believed in institutions. The other believed institutions would never save the working man, and in their hatred they mirrored each other. Two men unable to compromise. Two men who believed they were right. When President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Hoffa released a statement expressing sympathy, but made no mention of Robert. And when Robert was assassinated in 1968, Hoffa was serving time at Lewisburg Penitentiary. There were no public tears, only silence. Two warriors gone from the arena, one in a pine box, the other behind bars, and the years that followed, Hoffa would reflect on Kennedy often, never with regret, always with calculation. He respected Kennedy's relentlessness, but never forgave him, and in the American imagination, their feud became more than personal. It became symbolic of class, of justice, of what it means to fight for power and what it means to hold it. By the end of it all, both men had paid a price, but the nation had changed because through their conflict, the American public saw the underside of power, the deals, the grudges, the cracks beneath the marble floors of Capitol Hill. And in Jimmy Hoffa's war with Robert F. Kennedy, we saw something larger. Not just a rivalry, but a country asking itself what kind of power it truly believed in. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels staged, unnatural, like a breath being held by an entire building. It was March 4th, 1964, Chattanooga, Tennessee, a city lined with train whistles and magnolia trees, now caught in the gravity of a man who'd once controlled the roads, the trucks, the movement of American life itself. Jimmy Hoffa stood alone. No podium, no union banner behind him, just a defendant's table. His suit was pressed, his shoulders squared, but his eyes, they betrayed something deeper. Not fear, not guilt, disbelief. Because this time, the system had outmaneuvered him, and he knew it. The charges were straightforward in language, devastating in consequence. Jury tampering, conspiracy, mail and wire fraud. Not extortion, not racketeering, not murder. Just bribes offered, accepted, traced. For all the years the government had tried to bring him down. It wasn't the millions he moved through the pension fund or the mobsters he shook hands with that undid him. It was 12 strangers in a jury box, and the arrogance of thinking they could be bought. It started with whispers, rumors around the courthouse in Nashville, Hoffa's previous trial venue, that certain jurors had suddenly come into money. A new car, a home loan, a brother hired where he shouldn't have been. The FBI picked it up in early 1962. They had failed to pin anything solid on Hoffa for years, but this was different. They set up surveillance in Chattanooga, Hoffa's next trial venue, bugged hotel, rooms, tapped payphones, followed anyone who blinked too long near the courthouse, and they waited. The plan, according to prosecutors, was crude but effective. A man named Edward Grady Parton, a Louisiana teamster turned informant, approached the FBI with a bombshell. Hoffa had asked him to approach jurors, offer bribes, make sure the verdict went the right way. Parton was no saint. He had a criminal record. He was facing charges of his own, but what he lacked in credibility, he made up for in access, and the Bureau decided that if Hoffa wanted to play dirty, they'd play dirtier. Parton agreed to wear a wire, record conversations, collect names, lay traps, and slowly, piece by piece, the net closed in. One conversation, captured in late 1963, would become the centerpiece of the trial. Parton: "You sure this is the way?" Hoffa: "You want a conviction? Then make sure the vote goes our way. I don't care how you do it. Just get it done." 8 seconds of tape, enough to turn suspicion into prosecution. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't theatrical. It was said like ordering coffee, routine. Expected, that was the horror of it. In court, the government built a quiet storm. Not dramatic, But methodical, they brought receipts. Flight logs, testimony, recordings, they showed the jury how influence works. Not with a gun, but with a handshake and an envelope. And they painted Hoffa not as a gangster, but as a man who thought rules didn't apply to him anymore. It wasn't just corruption, it was hubris. Hoffa's defense fired back. They said Parton was a liar, a convict, a man with every reason to sell stories for a deal. They said the tapes were edited. They said the government had a vendetta, and some believed them, because Hoffa wasn't a villain to everyone, to millions. He was still a working man's prophet. Rough, flawed, but loyal still. The evidence stacked high, and on that March morning, the verdict came in guilty. Hoffa didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands folded in front of him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, a generation's mythology shifted. The man who once made presidents take his calls now stood convicted by the very system he had mocked, and behind that, something colder stirred. A realization that this time there would be bars. The sentence came weeks later, 13 years in federal prison, no parole until at least 1971. He was 51 years old, still sharp, still feared, but no longer untouchable. They sent him to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, a maximum security facility known for housing men who had become too powerful for their own good. There were no speeches, no rallies, just steel doors, concrete floors, and a metal cot bolted to the wall. To the guards, he was inmate number 17,472. To the outside world, he was still Hoffa, and even from a cell, he refused to disappear every morning. He shaved. Every afternoon, he wrote letters, memos, drafts of policy. He ran Local 299 from inside. Not officially, but effectively. He used lawyers as messengers, wrote notes in code, held court in the prison library with other inmates as advisors. He wasn't just waiting, he was planning, because in Hoffa's mind, this wasn't the end. It was intermission. He appealed the sentence twice. Both failed. He filed lawsuits against the Justice Department, against former associates, even against media outlets. He claimed the trial was a setup, that the FBI had manipulated testimony, that Kennedy's obsession had poisoned the system. Whether he believed that or not, no one could say, but he acted like he believed it, because belief in justice and vengeance and resurrection had always been his fuel. Inside Lewisburg, Hoffa became a paradox. Some inmates feared him, others idolized him. He mentored young prisoners, organized reading groups, fought with wardens over work assignments and library rules. He filed so many complaints that guards gave him a nickname, the Warden of Words. He laughed once when he heard it, but only once, in private. He wrote longhand memoir pages that no one ever saw. He mapped out what he called the return. He knew the Union had changed without him. He knew new power brokers were rising, some friendly, some not, but Hoffa believed in memory and loyalty. He believed that the rank and file still remembered the man who brought home contracts and pensions, and he planned to reclaim it. By 1969, whispers of a pardon began to circulate. The Nixon administration, under pressure from labor leaders and Teamster intermediaries, weighed the optics. Some said Nixon saw Hoffa as useful, a destabilizing force that could pull labor support in future elections. Others say it was money, Teamster fundraisers for Republican candidates, favors promised. Behind the scenes, in December 1971, the rumors became real. President Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence. He was released from prison after nearly 5 years, but freedom came with a clause. He was barred from engaging in union activity until 1980, a condition Hoffa never truly accepted. He smiled for the cameras, waved to reporters. walked out into the Pennsylvania cold with a defiant squint. But inside, he seethed, because power isn't something you hold, it's something you are. And they had tried to tell him he wasn't anymore. He didn't stay quiet, didn't rest, didn't retire. He gave interviews, met with former allies, scouted support for a comeback, knowing full well that others, especially his old friends in the mob, did not want him back. But Hoffa never asked permission. Not in 1932, not in 1957, not in prison, and not now. The jury had convicted him. The government had jailed him. The system had tried to erase him, but Jimmy Hoffa still believed in one truth, that no verdict, no sentence, could kill a man who refused to stop moving. And somewhere deep in the folds of his mind, the next move was already forming, because Hoffa wasn't done, not yet. It was December 23rd, 1971. The sky above Lewisburg Penitentiary hung gray and motionless, like a curtain waiting to fall. Inmate 17,472 had just been called to the warden's office. He walked slow, not from fatigue, but from habit, a ritualized, precise kind of patience that had kept him alive for nearly 5 years behind steel and concrete. Inside, the warden didn't rise when Hoffa entered. He simply handed him a single sheet of paper, official letterhead, a presidential seal. At the bottom, a name that still made rooms shift, Richard Milhouse Nixon. And just like that, Jimmy Hoffa was free. He didn't smile, not yet, because beneath the headline, beneath the rare and politically loaded decision to commute his sentence, was a single line that twisted in his gut, subject to the condition that he shall not engage in direct or indirect management of any labor organization until March 6, 1980. 9 years, a lifetime. In union politics, a death sentence for any man who had built his identity from power. To the public, Hoffa nodded. He said the words, he shook the hands, but inside, something turned to stone. He had not been pardoned. He had been muzzled. Outside the gates, reporters swarmed. The December air cut through the press coats and microphones. But no one moved. They wanted the shot. Hoffa, stepping out, breathing free air. Coat slung over his shoulder like a returning general. He obliged, hair slicked back, jaw clenched, suit pressed. He waved once, but the defiance was still there, curled beneath the calm. The Nixon administration's decision had not been simple. For months, labor leaders had pressured the White House. The Teamsters had backed Nixon's 1968 campaign, financially and strategically. They'd delivered votes in battleground states, and Hoffa, despite being locked away, remained a symbol, one too large for any administration to ignore. Backroom discussions unfolded with precision. John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General, reportedly brokered the arrangement, the deal. Hoffa walks, but the threat of his return is neutralized, at least on paper, the moment he stepped outside. Hoffa started planning. He returned to Detroit, not to retire, but to reclaim the Union he'd built and moved on. Men like Frank Fitzsimmons now wore the title of Teamster President. Men Hoffa had once handpicked as lieutenants, now enjoying the throne he believed was still his. The pension fund he once managed had grown even fatter and even murkier. More casinos, more loans, more outsiders handling what he once controlled with iron precision. And worse, the mob. The same men who had backed him when it was convenient now seemed to prefer the quiet president over the old bulldog. That betrayal stung deeper than any cell wall. In public, Hoffa played it measured. He gave interviews, appeared on talk shows, spoke about reflection, about time with family, about peace. But privately, he made calls. He met with old allies in motel rooms and dim restaurants, men who once bled beside him in picket lines, now hesitant to answer his knock. The problem wasn't that they didn't respect him. The problem was that they no longer needed him. He found comfort in small rituals, driving alone through Detroit late at night, sitting for hours in his study, rereading old union contracts line by line, typing letters to political contacts on a Remington typewriter. One finger at a time, he still believed in the comeback. Still believed in the idea that loyalty had a longer memory than money. But time had a different agenda. The man now occupying Hoffa's chair had grown used to the title. He wasn't Hoffa's equal, not in charisma, not in force, but he had something Hoffa lacked: permission from the mob, from the government, from the new order of power. That preferred predictability over fire. Fitzsimmons expanded union influence without headlines. He negotiated quietly. He smiled more than he shouted. Too many. That made him a safer leader to Hoffa. It made him a coward. By 1973, Hoffa's resentment had crystallized into obsession. He hired legal teams to challenge the conditions of his release, filed petitions, appealed to the courts, argued that his civil rights were being denied, that his ban from labor politics was unconstitutional. The press followed the story with caution. Some still admired him. Others were wary, unsure whether the old Hoffa was a relic or a warning. But as Hoffa pushed harder, resistance grew. Whispers circulated that the mob was uncomfortable, that Hoffa's return would bring heat, scrutiny, subpoenas, federal attention, and in the underworld, attention was poison. Men who once backed him now met him with polite avoidance. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were delayed. Deals suddenly lost momentum. One night in the summer of 1974, Hoffa sat alone in a diner off Telegraph Road. The waitress brought him black coffee. 2 sugars. He barely touched it. He stared out the window for over an hour, watching taillights pass, one after the next, like a string of decisions already made without him. When she asked if he needed anything else, he said, "Yeah, I need the world to remember who the hell I am." She didn't know what to say that year. He published his memoir, Hoffa, the real story. It was part confession, part campaign. He painted himself as a victim of vendettas, a man wronged by politics and swallowed by headlines. He spoke of the working man, of the union's original fire, of the promise he believed had been broken. The book sold modestly. The message, not so much, because while Hoffa remembered himself as a king in exile, the world had already crowned a successor. Still, he pushed. He scheduled union gatherings off the record, held advisory sessions with local Teamster chapters, spoke at private events under the guise of nostalgia, what everyone knew, the truth. He wasn't just reminiscing, he was reaching, and someone somewhere was watching closely. By late 1974, rumors thickened that Hoffa was pressuring old associates, that he wanted to announce a run for union president in the next election cycle, that he'd begun asking questions about pension fund loans, questions that touched dangerous names, and in the MAB's logic there was only one kind of problem, the kind you solved permanently. He'd always believed he was too big to disappear. He believed that his history made him necessary, that his enemies needed him as much as they hated him. That respect, even if borrowed or broken, could be rebuilt. But Hoffa miscalculated something vital. In a world where silence was survival, he talked too much. In 1975, he began setting up a meeting with old friends, with old enemies, men like Anthony Provenzano, Tony Pro, the Genovese capo who once served as a Teamsters vice president, and Anthony Giacalone, Tony Jack, a Detroit street boss known for making things disappear quietly. Hoffa believed they could be reasoned with. That history meant something. That shared scars could still form a handshake. But history had moved on, and Hoffa, for all his intelligence and willpower, had become a liability to men who no longer Played by his rules, he was last seen on July 30th, 1975. But long before that, the decision had likely been made, not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but over a quiet dinner behind a locked door, where 3 or 4 men said yes. To making him go away, the Nixon pardon had given him back his freedom, but not his future, because the catch, that small clause about union activity, was never about the law. It was about containment. They opened the gate, but built a wall on the other side, and Jimmy Hoffa, who had never known how to sit still, spent the last years of his life clawing against it until the day came when no one heard him knocking anymore. It was a warm Wednesday afternoon, July 30th, 1975, the kind of day where the sky hung still over Michigan, quiet, suspiciously calm at 2:45 p.m., a maroon 1974 Pontiac Granville pulled into the lot of the Match's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburban slice of Detroit where maple trees lined the sidewalks and time moved just a little slower. Inside the car sat James Riddle Hoffa, age 62, gray-suited, white shirt, navy, tie, hair combed back, shoes polished. He had come for a meeting. 2 men were expected: Anthony Tony Provenzano, a Genovese capo, and former Teamsters vice president, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit Mafia street boss and longtime associate. It was supposed to be business. It was supposed to be a reconciliation. Instead, it became a vanishing. He arrived early, 2:15 p.m. Always early, always precise. That was Hoffa's rhythm. Appointments honored like gospel. He stepped inside the restaurant briefly, spoke to a hostess, ordered a drink, iced tea. Then he stepped back outside to wait. He stood near the front of the parking lot, arms crossed, shoulders tight. Witnesses later said he looked agitated, checking his watch, scanning the cars. One said he muttered under his breath. Another thought he looked nervous. No one saw him leave. At 2:45, he was seen pacing the sidewalk near the restaurant entrance. At 3 o'clock he was gone. The Pontiac remained parked, keys still in the ignition, Hoffa's wallet and heart medication untouched. Inside the Red Fox, his iced tea began to sweat. The first call came at 6 o'clock p.m. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, hadn't heard from him. He always called, always, by 8 o'clock. His son, James P. Hoffa, was driving through Bloomfield, retracing the route to the restaurant. By midnight, the police were involved. By morning, the FBI, and just like that, one of the most powerful men in American labor history became a missing person. The headlines landed like punches. Hoffa vanishes. No sign of former Teamsters boss. Foul play suspected. Reporters descended on the restaurant like flies. The pavement was combed. Nearby homes questioned. The pond behind the strip mall was drained. Nothing. What followed was a frenzy, not of justice, but of speculation. Had he been lured? Was he silenced? Was it a message? The theories unraveled with every news cycle. Some said he had been driven to a mob-safe house, shot and cremated. Others said he had been dissolved in acid, buried under Giants Stadium, dumped in the Detroit River, ground into parts at a meat-packing plant. No body, no confession, no physical evidence, only absence. The FBI set up a special task force, Hoffa, dedicated solely to his disappearance. More than 200 agents worked the case over the next 2 years. They conducted over 16,000 interviews, followed hundreds of leads, but nothing stuck. The crime scene was too clean, too quiet. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment murder. It was a plan, executed with military precision, the kind of job that leaves no trail. They traced Hoffa's final phone calls, one to Tony Giacalone, one to Tony Provenzano, Both denied any meeting had ever been scheduled. Giacalone claimed he was at a suburban athletic club during the time of the meeting. Provenzano was reportedly in New Jersey. The alibis were tight, too tight, and the FBI knew they were being played, but knowledge is not proof. They brought in known mobsters. They pressured drivers, tapped phones, dug up backyards and car lots across Michigan and New Jersey. Still, nothing. Every tip led to a dead end. Every whisper dissolved into rumor. It was as if the ground had swallowed him whole. But the timing made sense. Hoffa had been pushing hard for a comeback. He was contacting old allies, rattling cages, threatening to expose the misuse of Teamster pension funds. That pension fund, a $1 billion war chest, was now feeding casinos, hotels, political campaigns, and mob investments. With Hoffa gone, it flowed quietly. With him back, it could turn volatile. To the new order, Hoffa wasn't just inconvenient, he was dangerous. And to men like Tony Pro and Tony Jack, the past was just that. The past, loyalty didn't stretch into retirement, especially not when it threatened revenue. Investigators believed Hoffa had been picked up by someone he knew, someone he trusted, perhaps a Teamster driver, perhaps a mob associate posing as a mediator. He was likely driven from the restaurant to a secondary location, killed quickly, disposed of efficiently. Theories vary. Some say he was incinerated in a mob-connected trash facility in Hamtramck. Others suggest he was taken to a private home, shot twice in the back of the head, and buried in a shallow grave. A few say he was placed in a steel drum and dumped into a landfill outside Detroit. But each version shares the same ending. Silence in 1976. Hoffa was declared legally dead, but no grave was marked, no eulogy spoken, only headlines and conjecture. His wife Josephine never recovered. She died 2 years later, quietly, at home. She never moved out of the house they'd shared. The phone remained next to her chair, as if waiting. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance wasn't just a crime, it was a reckoning. A warning to those who confuse power with permanence. He believed his name still meant something. He believed the weight of his history was protection. But the men who once stood behind him on that hot July afternoon, the man who once held America's highways in his palm, waited on a sidewalk and was never seen again. It begins always with a whisper, a name muttered in a nursing home hallway, a map drawn shakily on yellowed paper, a phone call from a blocked number that ends before it begins. Since the afternoon Jimmy Hoffa vanished, the country has lived in the shadow of a question. What happened on July 30th, 1975? And more than that, who made sure it would never be answered? In the decades that followed, the search for Hoffa became something else. Not an investigation, a ritual every few years. A rumor surfaced, a confession leaked, a garage cracked, open a field scraped clean of topsoil, and every time the world paused, held its breath. Imagined the moment we'd all been waiting for, the discovery, the body, the final piece. But it never came because Hoffa didn't just disappear, he became myth, and myths are harder to bury than men. The FBI built their case on logic, their theory, constructed from wiretaps, informant reports, and internal union politics, was grim and straightforward. Hoffa had outlived his usefulness. He was threatening to return, to take back control of the Teamsters, to expose the financial handshakes between organized crime and the pension fund he once ruled with iron certainty. To the mafia, Hoffa was once a friend, but now he was a problem, and problems, in their world, are solved permanently. In 1976, the FBI released a confidential report, later made public through declassification, naming Anthony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone as primary suspects. It suggested that Hoffa was lured to the Machu's Red Fox under the false pretense of peace. That a car, likely driven by a union associate, picked him up around 2:45 p.m., that he was taken to a secondary location, murdered and disposed of swiftly, professionally. No panic, no mess. Just efficiency, but names were all they had. No bodies, no witnesses, no charges. And the men who might have told the truth either died, denied, or disappeared. Then, in 1995, a book was published, I Heard You Paint Houses, by Charles Brandt, based on interviews with former mob hitman Frank the Irishman Sheeran. In it, Sheeran confessed, said he had killed Hoffa, shot him twice in the back of the head in a house in northwest Detroit, allegedly on orders from Russell Bufalino, a quiet Pennsylvania don who operated with surgical invisibility. The phrase paint houses was code, blood splattering the walls. It was the language of men who cleaned up messes with bullets. According to Sheeran, Hoffa had been picked up by someone he trusted, possibly Sheeran himself, and taken to the house. There he was shot. His body, he claimed, was cremated in a local funeral home controlled by the mafia. No trace, no chance of recovery. The book gained traction. It felt real, detailed, human, even plausible. In 2019, the story was adapted into a film, The Irishman, directed by Martin Scorsese. Al Pacino played Hoffa. Robert De Niro played Sheeran. It reignited the public obsession, brought the story to a new generation. For many, it was the answer, but to the FBI, still unproven. The house Sheeran referenced was found. Forensics teams dug up the floorboards, found bloodstains, but DNA testing concluded it was not Hoffa's. Close, but not enough. Then came the Meadowlands theory, the infamous rumor that Hoffa had been buried beneath Giants Stadium, specifically under Section 107. The idea sounded absurd, cartoonish, but it stuck, partly because it was just wild enough to believe. A former mobster named Donald Tony the Greek Franco's claimed in 1989 that Hoffa's body had been transported in a steel drum and buried during construction of the stadium in 1976. The claim made headlines. Television crews descended on the stadium. Speculative diagrams were drawn, but no excavation was ever ordered, and no credible corroboration ever surfaced. It was a theory born from spectacle, not evidence, and like so many before it, it faded. Other theories were darker, quieter. Some suggested Hoffa had been taken to a remote horse farm in Milford, Michigan, where his body was ground up and fed to animals. Others said he had been placed in an oil drum, sealed and dropped into a Great Lakes shipping channel, the water too deep, the current too wide. One former hitman claimed Hoffa had been cut into pieces and buried in multiple shallow graves across northern Michigan, each no more than a few feet deep, erased over time by frost and foliage. Each of these claims came late in life, often on deathbeds, often told to reporters, authors, or FBI agents trying to connect dots that no longer existed. And every time they led to digging. In 2003, the FBI searched a backyard pool in Hampton Township. In 2006, they excavated a horse farm near Detroit. In 2012, they drilled beneath a suburban driveway in Roseville. All found nothing. And yet, the country still watches, still listens, because Jimmy Hoffa isn't just a missing person, he's a mirror of power, of betrayal, of American mythology gone crooked. There's another theory, one that has gained quiet traction in the halls of certain law schools and civil rights circles, that the government need, that the Justice Department, still burning with its unfinished war against Hoffa, allowed his disappearance. That federal surveillance teams missed too much to be innocent, that tapes were destroyed, leads abandoned. No one suggests direct involvement, but some believe silence can be just as fatal. It's speculation, but in the world of Hoffa, everything is. In 2013, the FBI declassified 1,000 pages of Hoffa case files, some redacted, some inconclusive, but buried in those pages were fragments, names, partial quotes, informant notations, enough to confirm what many had already assumed. Hoffa didn't disappear by accident. He was removed, and the people who knew how, they were protected by time, by fear, or by dirt that no longer stains today. The Manchas Red Fox is gone. Renovated, rebranded, just another suburban storefront. But the parking space is still there. You can stand where he stood, where he checked his watch, where he looked up one last time expecting a car that never came. No plaque, no marker, just asphalt. Jimmy Hoffa was declared legally dead in 1982. No funeral, no grave, just paperwork. His legacy remains split. To some, a thug, a criminal, a man who invited his own destruction. To others, a fighter, a voice for the forgotten, a casualty of a world that no longer had room for his kind of fire. To everyone else, he remains a question, one that no confession has answered, one that no grave has claimed, one that no truth has fully owned. The stories keep coming. They always will, because as long as there are secrets, as long as there are men with guilt behind their teeth, there will be someone somewhere whispering, "I know where Jimmy Hoffa is," and the world will lean closer. Once again, it was the silence that lingered, not the headlines, not the whispers, not even the threats. It was the absence, the hollow where a voice used to be. The union still held meetings, still signed contracts, still collected dues, but it was like watching a cathedral continue services long after the altar had been cleared. The fire was gone, and so was the man who lit it, after Jimmy Hoffa vanished. In July 1975, the Teamsters were left to pick through the pieces of something once mythic, an empire of trucks and pensions, of lunch pails and handshakes, all now hovering between legacy and liability. Hoffa had built the Teamsters into the largest, most politically powerful union in American history, but he'd also opened its doors wide to the very men who may have sealed his fate. When he disappeared, there was no official succession plan, no emergency protocol, just a vacuum, and vacuums have always been hungry. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's longtime deputy and rival, stepped in as president. He had been Hoffa's hand-picked successor during his prison stint, a safe choice at the time, a compromise, but Fitzsimmons lacked the edge, the charisma, the fight. He kept the seat warm, but he couldn't fill it, and behind him, in the shadows, real power shifted elsewhere, to the mob, to the money men, to the enforcers who didn't need microphones or picket signs, just silence and fear. The Central States Pension Fund, once Hoffa's weapon of leverage, became a feeding trough. Billions of dollars moved without scrutiny, loans made, to mobbed-up casinos in Vegas, investments in real estate schemes and rackets that never saw daylight. The FBI described it as the mob's private piggy bank, a Fortune 500 company with no board, no oversight, and no conscience. Where Hoffa had used it as both shield and sword, others used it like a faucet, and it bled the rank and file. Felt it. They may not have known the details, the contracts, the kickbacks, the envelopes slid across tables in hotel bars, but they felt the drift. Morale cracked, strikes fizzled, trust drained away. What once felt like a movement now resembled a machine, oiled by fear, not purpose, driven by profit, not justice. Reformers tried. There were men and women who believed the union could be cleaned, that the Teamsters didn't have to be a punchline or a cautionary tale. In the late 70s and early 80s, grassroots efforts formed to push for democratic elections, financial transparency, and a divorce from organized crime. Some gained traction, some even made it to courtrooms. But for every victory, there was a name added to a watch list, A tire slashed, a warehouse burned, a phone call in the middle of the night that said, "Don't." Change was possible, but dangerous and slow. And Hoffa's ghost hung over it all. In 1999, James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son, was elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He had spent years climbing the ranks, studying law, building coalitions. His campaign was heavy with symbolism. The Hoffa name still carried weight, still conjured images of a working man who'd fought billionaires and bullies. James promised to rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost, and in many ways he did. Under his leadership, the union stabilized, membership grew modestly, corruption investigations declined, but the spark, that incandescent rage mixed with charisma that his father wielded like a weapon, it was gone, and maybe, deep down, America had changed too much to want it back. The world Hoffa had once thrived in, the smoke-filled backrooms, the fierce speeches on loading docks, the war against both corporations and Congress had eroded. Globalization, automation, a younger workforce skeptical of unions. By the time James took the podium, the fight had moved, and the ring wasn't the same. Still, the question remains, what did Hoffa's absence truly cost? Not just to the Teamsters, but to the idea of labor power in America? He was far from perfect. He made enemies faster than allies. He walked the edge of legality, then often stepped clean off it. But he gave workers something few leaders ever do. The belief that they mattered, that their voice could shake Washington, that their hands built the country and they deserved a seat at the table. When Hoffa disappeared, that belief didn't die overnight, but it began to flicker, and in the decades since, it's never burned quite as bright. Today, the union still stands, stronger in some ways, weaker in others. It has survived federal oversight, criminal trials, economic collapse. It has modernized, rebranded, and persisted. But there's a shadow where a man once stood, a space at the head of the table that no one quite fits, and in that space lives the memory of Jimmy Hoffa, not just the man or the myth, but the sound of a voice that didn't flinch, a voice that could turn a warehouse floor into a battlefield, a courtroom into a pulpit, a handshake into a revolution. A union without that voice is still a union, but it's not the same. It starts with the name, Jimmy Hoffa, sharp, compact, like a punch to the gut, like a signature carved into wet cement. It's not just a name anymore. It's a myth, an echo, a question without an answer. The man disappeared, but the story never left. In the decades that followed, July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa became something else, something larger than a man in a suit, larger than a union president, larger even than his enemies. He became a symbol, a betrayal of vanished power, of promises buried beneath parking lots in silence, and in that absence, in that vacuum of truth, the myth grew teeth. It began with whispers, then headlines, then books. "I heard you paint houses," Frank Sheeran said, a confession, a claim, a final stroke of paint on a canvas no one could verify. Hollywood followed, scripts passed hand to hand, treatments reworked in smoky rooms. By the time Al Pacino stepped into Hoffa's shoes, in The Irishman, the man was no longer just remembered, he was reinterpreted. But not all versions were kind. Some painted him as a martyr, others as a megalomaniac, a man who flew too close to the sun and didn't burn, just vanished. He was the working man's champion. He was the mob's puppet. He was the last lion. Of labor, he was the architect of his own destruction. Pick your poison. America had room for all of them. In Detroit, they still speak his name in the present tense. Bars hang framed portraits of his grin. Old-timers tap their knuckles on worn counters and say, Jimmy wouldn't have stood for this. In Vegas, whispers of pension money still float across blackjack tables. The legend is never far from the lights. And across the Midwest, Toledo, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, the factories still carry his ghost, even if the unions don't, because myths are malleable and Hoffa, more than most, knew how to bend image into influence. Even when he was alive, he orchestrated his public face. He gave interviews with defiant charm. He stared down senators. He walked into courtrooms like they were theaters, and every flashbulb was a spotlight. But once he vanished, he lost control of the script. And America, always hungry for icons, wrote the rest. In the books, he's a blueprint. In the movies, a tragedy. In the jokes, a punchline. They say he's under Giants Stadium. They say he's in a drum in Jersey. They say he never died. Just moved to Argentina and kept organizing truckers under a new name, Truth. It hardly matters now. What mattered was the feeling that someone had stood up to power and vanished because of it. That the man who once said, "You've got a problem with me? You come tell me," was silenced not with words, but with erasure. And in a country that worships both rebellion and order, he became the contradiction it couldn't resist. He was proof that legacy doesn't require a body, only an outline. He became the working-class phantom, the missing titan. Children of dock workers who never met him still wear his face on T-shirts. Truckers in Kentucky have bumper stickers that read, "What would Jimmy do?" Even those born long after he vanished can recognize his name, not from history books, but from culture, from lore. And what does that say about us? That we remember the myth more than the man? That we turn the flesh and blood figure into an American ghost story? Maybe it speaks to what we long for. A leader who didn't flinch, a fighter who didn't apologize, a man who played dirty, but for us. Maybe we know he wasn't clean. Maybe that's why we believed in him. Because perfection doesn't start revolutions, but fury does. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa was neither saint nor villain. He was both. He was the last breath of labor's golden age, and the first warning shot of what happens when power is left unchecked. He walked the line between corruption and conviction, and then he vanished. And in that vanishing, he became immortal. So, maybe the real truth, the one no theory, no confession, no excavation has ever uncovered, is this: Jimmy Hoffa never wanted to disappear, but the country needed him too, not to mourn, but to mythologize, because in a nation built on ambition, there's no greater story than the man who wanted too much and paid the price without leaving a trace. They never wrote their names in bold, no headlines, no memoirs, no statues, but they knew. They were the men who stood at the edges of rooms, holding car keys, lighting cigars, counting unmarked bills, men who didn't speak unless spoken to, men who knew too much and never enough. They weren't giants like Hoffa, but they circled him, like satellites around a burning sun. The first was Salvatore Brigaglio, a quiet executioner with dead eyes and clean cuffs. They called him Sally Bugs. He didn't smile much. He didn't need to. He was allegedly in the car that summer day in 1975 outside the Macha's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. Some say he pulled the trigger. Some say he only drove. But when the FBI knocked on his door, he answered in silence. Years later, before he could be compelled to talk, he was gunned down in the streets of Little Italy. 4 shots to the face, a 5th to the heart, in broad daylight, as if to say, this is what knowing gets you. Then there was Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son and everything but blood. He drove for Jimmy, ate with him, laughed like a brother. But loyalty is a complicated thing. Chucky was long suspected of driving the car that took Hoffa to his final destination. The FBI hounded him. The press crucified him, and though he denied it until the end, the stain never lifted. In interviews, his voice cracked when he spoke Hoffa's name. "I loved him," he'd say. "I would never..." But love is not an alibi, and shadows don't fade just because you want them to. Tony Provenzano, known as Tony Pro, wore the Teamsters like a second skin, and the mob like a badge of pride. A made man, a feared man. His feud with Hoffa was no secret. They had shouted at each other in prison, threats made, lines drawn. When Hoffa tried to return, Tony Pro was waiting. The last confirmed meeting Hoffa had was supposed to include Tony. He never showed, or maybe he did. Depending on who you believe, Provenzano died in prison in 1988. His secrets buried with him. There were others, men with nicknames and scars: Frank Coppola, Gabe Brigaglio, Tommy Andretta. Men who passed through back alleys and union halls like ghosts in expensive suits. They had reasons to stay quiet. Wives, daughters, neighbors, and reasons to talk. Regret, guilt, or just a weight of time, but few ever did. And those who did spoke in fragments the FBI tried. They followed the scent for years, pulled dozens of men into rooms with one-way mirrors, played tapes, waited, watched. Operation Disappearance was launched in 1976. It lasted until 1982. Agents combed through union records, pension files, real estate holdings. They chased whispers from Detroit to Miami to Vegas. They dragged the Rouge River, dug up empty lots in Jersey, pulled floorboards from garages. They found nothing, no blood, no tooth, no shirt button, not even a thread, but the recordings remain in one. A hushed voice says, "We gave it to him good. Put him where he won't be found." And another, "That guy made too much noise, had to go. They flew the body out same night." But tapes don't testify, and a whisper doesn't count in court. In the early 2000s, a name resurfaced. Frank Sheeran, a union enforcer, a tall Irishman with a hollow stare. On his deathbed, he claimed to be the man who shot Hoffa in a house in Detroit. He said they burned the body in a furnace, that the floor was soaked with blood, that Jimmy never saw it coming, but forensics found no trace, no blood in the carpet, no residue on the walls still. Sheeran's story, recorded in "I Heard You Paint Houses," became the most famous version of the tale. Some believe him, others call it delusion, dressed as confession. A dying man writing himself into history, and still the coffin is empty. There's a line in one of the final FBI field notes. "Everyone is dead or dying. We're running out of..." Men who knew? Maybe that's the ending Hoffa's killers always wanted. Not silence, but forgetfulness, because silence can be cracked, but a grave without bones, that endures, and so we are left with fragments, quotes clipped from wiretaps, faces half lit in old surveillance photos, men who shuffled papers or opened doors and never spoke aloud what they saw, men who knew, men who carried the weight, men who went to sleep each night wondering if the knock would come, and when the knocks stopped, when the questions faded, they died quietly, without fanfare, without closure, leaving behind a trail of silences louder than any confession. There is no gravestone, no plot number, no shaded bench for grandchildren to visit, no weather-worn bouquet left on anniversaries of birth or death. Only a name, spoken, speculated, scattered across decades like smoke in the wind. James Riddle Hoffa, born February 14th, 1913. Disappeared July 30th, 1975. That's the sum of it, bookended by fire and fog. He was born poor. In Brazil, Indiana, son of a coal miner, his father died when Jimmy was young, leaving a mother to raise 4 children on raw grit and hard hours. By 14, he was unloading produce trucks in Detroit. By 20, he was organizing strikes, not because someone told him to, but because he saw how easily men were used and discarded. He believed in labor not as an ideal, but as an inheritance. A man's dignity wasn't measured by how high he rose, but by how hard he fought to be heard. That belief, loud and unwavering, carried him through boardrooms and jail cells, through Senate hearings and mafia backrooms, through loyalty and betrayal, and then he was gone. No confession, no body, no final phone call, just a parking lot and an unanswered engine. They looked for him in rivers and scrapyards. They tore up basement floors, chased whispers across 3 time zones, and still nothing. What Hoffa left behind was not a body, but a silence shaped like a man. He became a riddle America couldn't solve and maybe didn't want to. A symbol of ambition that burned too hot, a warning carved in myth to his enemies. He was a menace to his allies, a martyr to history, an ellipsis. He is the only major American figure of the 20th century to vanish without trace. No headline ever read "Justice for Hoffa." There was no trial, no mourning period, no funeral, just questions and the uncomfortable truth that maybe some men, too proud, too loud, too dangerous, don't get endings. In the years since his son James P. Hoffa took up the Union mantle, but the fire never burned as hot. The crowds never roared the same. There was only one Jimmy, and he had vanished into legend. They made movies, wrote books, plastered his name on cold case files, but no camera ever captured. The last seconds no document ever settled the doubt. Even now the question haunts rooms. Where is Hoffa? But perhaps the more honest question is, why do we need to know? Because we fear what he became, a man erased by power yet immortalized by mystery. He is not buried beneath a stone. He is buried in memory, in rumor, in the uneasy quiet between fact and fiction, and maybe that was always the only ending he could have. Not a trial, not a bullet, not a farewell, but a disappearance so absolute it became eternal. Jimmy Hoffa didn't get a grave. He got something far more dangerous, a myth. Without a marker, it was supposed to be a simple lunch. The reservation was made. 2 seats at a corner table, Machu's Red Fox, Bloomfield Township, Michigan. A steakhouse dressed in polite wood and quiet formality, suburban elegance, white tablecloths, iced tea poured in advance. He was expected at 2:00 p.m. It was July 30th, 1975. A Wednesday, hot. Heavy air hung across the parking lot like breath waiting to be exhaled. Jimmy Hoffa arrived early. He always did. 10 minutes before the hour, crisp suit, polished shoes, eyes